welcome to the History of the Land of Israel podcast. I am Shael Ben Ephraim, and I welcome you to the one podcast with the guts to survey the most provocative historical narrative in the world. Episode 2, The Land Itself. The land of Israel has always been divisive. Just look at the gap between these descriptions. First, let's go to our old standby, Exodus 3:8. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Meanwhile, on the other side of the spectrum, we have Mark Twain, who visited the land in the 19th century. And here was his impression. The further we went, the hotter the sun got, and the more rocky and bare, repulsive and dreary the landscape became. There was hardly a tree or a shrub anywhere. Even the olive and the cactus, those fast friends of a worthless soil, had almost deserted the country. He summarized his impressions in the following way. Palestine is desolate and unlovely. And why should it be otherwise? Can the curse of the deity beautify a land? Palestine is no more of this workday world. It is sacred to poetry and tradition. It is dreamland. But what is this country really like? We need answers. After all, the star of this podcast isn't a particular people or religion. Instead, our glamorous leading lady is the land of Israel itself. So let's get to know her a bit better. We all know that size isn't everything. But when it comes to the land of Israel, it might be the most essential feature of it. The modern state of Israel measures a mere 250 miles from its northernmost point in Metula to the southernmost port of Eilat. But if that sounds small, consider how narrow the land is. It is less than 40 miles wide at the narrowest point, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean coast. Although fixed borders are a recent innovation in the Middle East, the land of Israel has always been, more or less, its own geographical unit. To the east sits the North Arab Desert, which takes up 75% of the territory of modern Jordan. To the west are the Mediterranean and Sinai Desert. To the south are the Red Sea and, more desert. None of these areas were suitable for prominent cities and stable civilizations, forcing the societies in the land of Israel into narrow confines. As a result, although many innovations came from Israel, including, as we'll discuss, reliable agriculture and possibly even the controlled use of fire, it lagged behind foreign competitors. Meanwhile, the north, where modern Lebanon and Syria are, were more open and contained more sustainable cities and societies. But they led into Anatolia and Mesopotamia, which were larger centers of power throughout most of history. Therefore, they were often within the orbit of powers dominating those areas. The centers of early civilization were indeed quite close. Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, even the Minoans and the Arabs were too close for comfort, further boxing in the civilizations in the land of Israel. But that was also the advantage of the land, that it served as a crossroads. And therefore the importance of this area was apparent from early in human history. We've all heard that Africa is the cradle of mankind. And indeed, according to just about every theory, the first hominins, our first ancestors, to existed in Africa and left that area in order to go around the world. That means that the future Holy Land was a crucial link in spreading Homo sapiens throughout the world. Now, there may or may not have been another path for them. For those who crossed over from Africa into Asia and Europe, we don't really know. And we'll talk about that a little bit in a future episode. But either way, it was a major waypoint, possibly the only waypoint. Therefore, most of those who went through the Levant, who went out of Africa, I should say, passed through the Levant at one point or another. And a good portion of them chose to stay there. The ease of passage has sharpened the area's importance, even in comparison to Lebanon, which is another waypoint. While that area is more mountainous and difficult to traverse and does not link directly to Africa, much of Israel is flat or covered with modest hills, and it has wadis, valleys, that make transportation easier. Therefore, shipping from the Mediterranean and heading inland would usually travel through Israel instead of Lebanon and Syria. Even the Phoenicians would trade inland through Chatzol and other Canaanite city-states instead of heading into the Bekaa Valley and the mountains over there. As I have already implied, the fertility of the land also played a role in its importance. Today, much of the land of Israel remains a fertile strip between two arid zones, the Negev-Sinai area, stretching from Beersheba into Egypt, and Jordan. That is why it would host some of the earliest farming communities on earth. That was where you could grow things. But unfortunately, that meant their communities were open to taxing and plunder by outside powers. And often there was no state of consequence to defend them, or states that simply were unable to. These two facts had massive implications for the political and social structure of the land. First, it was too small to sustain a mighty empire, and acted as a point of passage for trade and armies for the larger powers. So, analysts of geopolitics have long maintained that geography is destiny. The great thinker of that school of thought, Harold Mackinder, said, "Man, and not nature, initiates, but nature, in large measure, controls." Indeed, while humans build kingdoms and plan strategies, they are always constrained by geography. That was doubly true in ancient times, when communications and logistics made conquest and expansion particularly difficult. Now, let's talk a little bit about climate. A lot of time has passed since those biblical days, but the weather remains quite similar. There are only two seasons in Israel, both now and then, summer and winter. Summer gets very hot and is dry in most of the country. Meanwhile, winter is mild near the coast, but can get quite bitter and rainy as you go further inland and up north. It usually rains for a total of around 30 days per year, obviously depending where you are. However, there is always the danger of severe droughts when it does not hit that mark. The region's topography is essential for understanding how societies there have developed. Here is one description from a geographer. The land of Israel comprises of a narrow coastal plain, two parallel mountain ranges with a rift valley in between, and an eastward sloping plateau dissected by many eastward running wadis. Because the mountains divided the area, and rainfall divides the area as well, two distinct, though dependent ecosystems figure heavily in the early history of the southern Levant, of the land of Israel. The coastal region, which is richest in natural food resources, the Jordan Rift Valley area, from the Gulf of Eilat up to modern Damascus, has proved quite conducive both to current agriculture and early agriculture on both sides of the rift in what is today Jordan and Israel. In addition, the area includes valleys and gorges, which allow for the gathering of rainfall. Now, in both strips, the northern areas get more rainfall, while the southernmost regions are more arid and prone to becoming deserts when precipitation levels are low. And now for a few words on biodiversity. There was a good deal of it in the region in the distant past. In particular, there were more large predators and games than today, since Homo sapiens were less effective hunters than they are today, and also the climate was quite different. Antelopes, boar, and deer were plentiful, especially on the coast and Galilee grasslands. Wild goats and sheep were found in the lowlands and drier areas, and many of them were cultivated and domesticated by humans later on. Back then, you could also see the wild cattle that, when they were domesticated, became the backbone of many agricultural farmsteads. Also, one of the reasons the earliest agricultural farmsteads grew in the land of Israel. At certain times, this land contained animals we wouldn't associate with it at all. For example, elephants dwell there as recently as 400,000 years ago. Our ancestors even developed special tools to scoop out and eat elephant bone marrow, as we learned from the Gesher Bnot Yaakov find, which we will discuss in greater detail in the next episode. The elephants in Israel were straight tusk ones, about twice as big as modern elephants. In fact, one Israeli researcher believes they played a crucial role in helping humans cross over from Africa, in part of the out of Africa theory. So Tel Aviv professor Ran Barkai, Tel Aviv University professor Ran Barkai says, there are strong arguments to claim that prehistoric people used elephants' migrating routes to travel out of Africa. Indeed, he says, elephants are highly dependent on water and have very good memory, so they may have paved the way for humans to leave Africa and spread into other regions. So we may have elephants to thank for the fact that we don't all live in Africa today. Now, let's talk about what is grown in the land of Israel, since, as we said, it was such an early center of agriculture. The humans living in the pre-agricultural land of Israel were already quite familiar with cereals and other staples. Now, at first, agriculture was used to supplement the nomadic lifestyle. Then, some individuals relied on grains to provide them with an increasingly more significant proportion of their caloric intake. This process occurred between 13,000 and 11,000 BCE, and we'll talk about it a little more later on. It was aided by the climate amelioration, that means the moderation of the bitter cold that was in the area, which had begun a few thousand years earlier, probably around 17,000 BCE, making some of the desert terrain more habitable. Looking at diets, we can get some clues from the Torah. In that context, the land is famously called the land of milk and honey. It often refers to the land's bounty as wheat, wine, and oil. In other words, that classic healthy Mediterranean diet. An early Egyptian tale, written well before the book of Exodus, the tale of Sinew, refers to Canaan in the following manner. Figs were in it and grapes. It had more wine than water. Abundant was its honey. Plentiful its oil. All kinds of fruit were on the trees. Barley was there and emmer, and no end of cattle of all kind, as well as desert game and milk dishes of any kind imaginable. Now, on some level, this tale is a poetic exaggeration, but we also have to keep something else in mind. The Egyptian writers of the tale of Sinew were used to a desert climate, at least in the areas that weren't directly around the Nile River. So northern and middle Canaan were far more fertile than the lands they were used to. By comparison, it seemed incredibly rich with produce. And that is one of the major elements behind the conception of the land of Israel as the land of milk and honey. In comparison to the deserts next to it, it certainly was. Now, the agricultural products of the land have changed significantly over the years. In biblical times, the staples grown were wheat, barley, figs, vines, olives, dates, and pomegranates, all of which are still associated with the land of Israel. Wheat, not as much as it used to be. But none of them play a particularly significant role in modern Israeli agriculture. Today, Israeli agriculture is based on irrigation, which allows it to grow more water-rich products, maybe not for long, depending on global warming, etc. Therefore, some of the more modern crops include oranges, cotton, sugar, beet, vegetable, potatoes, and apples, none of which were grown in the land of Israel in biblical times.